So hello everybody, thanks a lot for the invitation. My name is Timo Lochocki. I'm coming from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. That's why I inquired whether Mr. Donfried will be here, because I am getting paid by his sister, Karen Donfried, the president of our very organization. So why am I talking to you today? I am talking to you because I want to present to you the prime challenge to a multicultural society as such, namely the rise of right-wing populist parties in Europe over the last 20, 30 years. Why am I supposed to be talking about this? I am talking about this because I wrote my PhD on the subject. Originally, as I started out with my PhD 5 years ago or so, I was wondering about which societies do a good job in integrating migrants, in ensuring a multicultural vivre ensemble, and which are those who fail. And then eventually, over the first year of my research, rather desk research, I figured that there's a prime challenge lurking, namely that some societies bear fruit to these movements and others do not. And these movements then excel a huge impact on how the society deals with migration, multiculturalism. So now, after 3 or 4 or 5 years of research, I'm very much convinced of that there is 1, 2, 3 prime factors which impede on whether societies succeed in achieving multiculturalism, whether they fail. And the prime variable which ought to be taken into consideration here is most certainly the rise or the fall of these movements. As such, they ought to be understood very, very properly, and to my reading, 95% of the stuff you read in newspapers, be it German, Italian, Spanish, French, Norwegian, these reports on these parties are extremely flawed and misled. Because the public perception is extremely tainted by what people like to read. In doing so, they neglect a large share of scientific scrutiny on the subject. That's why I would like to present you 7 theses, 7 arguments, which are rather uncontested in scientific journals or books, but which, at least to my reading, have been extremely contested in public discourse whenever you present them to people who don't do research on the subject. Thus, I hope to enlighten and spark a discussion on the topic. But before I dive into my presentation, I'd like to get a brief glimpse, a grasp of your first perceptions and take on the matter. So the first question I'd have is, who of you stems from a country with a strong right-wing populist party? If you could be so kind to raise your hand. Oh, only 3? Okay. So right-wing populist parties are, for instance, the Front National, Vlaams Belang, Fremskrittspartiet De Neue, or UKIP in, sorry? Lega Nord, for instance, yes. So, sorry, so who basically lives or comes from a country where these movements are strong? So that means that 90% of you come from a country which does not have a right-wing populist party, which means you're either Spanish or Irish. Okay, no, I'm not kidding. So you're from Spain and Ireland. That's really key.
We have a lot of Spanish people.
Yeah.
All right, okay. Then interesting, because then basically I will talk about the reasons why these parties come up, and you can take the information back home and tell the politicians what they should do and what they shouldn't do. Because Spain and Ireland, as I just said, are the only countries in Germany, in Europe, in Western Europe at least, which do not harbor such a strong party. Then my second question would be, do you think in general that the rise of these parties is rather negative or rather positive? Who thinks this is negative? Okay, and who thinks it's rather positive? All right. Then I'm going to come back to this, and this mere fact that nobody raised the finger already explains a lot on why they rise. Because the public perception on these parties is extremely tainted by a certain perception of what these parties do and why they exist. And this very mere fact that people who tend to be in leading, governing, advising positions later on disregard these parties has a huge impact on their rise. But I will come back to that. And now the last question before I start talking for real, is there anyone from Germany here? All right. Would you consider the Alternative für Deutschland being a right-wing populist party, or would you say, well, you know, they're still about to find their course?
Sorry, the Alternative
For Deutschland, do you think it's it's part of the right-wing populist party family, like the Front National or Lega Nord, or do you think, no, it's something different?
Well, it's difficult to say because I think it's something different out of the cause for it. Why people came there, I think it's two different kind of groups, at least two different kind of groups of people who are there. So you cannot really define it, and yeah, it's similar to the PDDA movement as well.
You're right. Because as apparently most of you are not from Germany, we are in Germany now facing a party from that camp, which scientific scrutiny rather is uncertain right now, whether it's the right-wing populist party or not. But actually that was a lie. Public discourse is still pondering. For scientific scrutiny, it's super obvious this is the right-wing populist party, period. I'm saying this because in Germany, this debate is really piling up with the State Department, with the Department for the Interior, with the Chancellor's Office, that we are now en route to embark on a similar development and a similar political trait as the French and the Italians are for 20 or 30 years already. So this is really an issue that sparks high interest with a lot of important people in Germany in these years, because there was this very misled assumption that German history, however it would have worked out, would have prevented Dutch parties from rising. And now you see that these arguments were totally misled and fraud, and the Germans are not immune to these movements. In fact, these movements thrive extremely well here as in other places. Okay. The first slide, don't you worry, it's the only slide with a lot of text. Other than that, I'm only going to talk about graphs and colors, and I hope it's going to be digestible fairly easy. First question is, why are these parties being voted for? What do they stand for? There you have a problem that people say, well, you know, you can by no means compare these parties. There's so much dependency on national particularities, on discoursive cultures, on socioeconomic conditions, on national historical trajectories, and so forth. This is all true to a certain extent, but scientific scrutiny, especially using long-term data, meaning large N studies, found that these parties have one common denominator, which can be seen across the board and which seems to be the prime reason why people vote for them. And this is that these parties' programs more or less consist of two statements. The first thing is, you know, holy shit, life got complicated. Nobody has an answer. Everything seems to be far more colorful, far more complicated, far more international, far more diverse than before. And we have a super easy solution to this. We just stop this once and for all. We come back to the alleged homogeneous, isolated, culturally, ethnically black and white societies of the 80s. This is the prime solution they propose in their programs. And this is the common denominator you usually find. Of course, it's arranged differently from country to country, setting to setting, but more or less this is the core of the program. They provide something like you could frame as a nostalgic nationalism. Or in one sense, well, you know, things used to be so easy, so awesome back then. Let's just go back to back then. The second part of the program is these harsh anti-elite stances. And these are highly intertwined with their nationalism. Why? Because if you propose, let's go back to the cozy times of the 80s, 70s, you need to have an explanation why the cozy times have been gone. And the cozy times are gone because these guys governing the countries in the last 30, 40 years did a horribly bad job. That's why you accuse them for everything what you consider as having turned out in the wrong direction. So their program can be summarized in, you are for the glorified past of the nation, and you're against the political elite, against the political establishment. As said, this is a very rough, oversimplified narrative here, but this you can find across the board from Finland to the Netherlands, down to Greece, Italy, and back to Germany. This is the common denominator. The second point comparative research has established a consensus on is that you can most certainly, based on the first slide, talk about a right-wing populist party family. And this right-wing populist party family is extremely important to be distinguished from right extreme parties, like the NPD, neo-Nazi movements, and they most certainly need to be distinguished from liberal parties and, even more important, from conservative parties. Even though right-wing populist parties do a very good job in presenting themselves as belonging to the conservative or liberal party family, they most certainly rely on a certain strategy, on certain features you can only find with them. And this is also very important to emphasize, to underline. They should not be confused with right extreme parties. The prime difference is between right extreme parties and right populist parties that right extreme parties want to get rid of democracy. This is not what right-wing populist parties want. This is a very crucial point. It might be that based on your political positioning, you think this is rather a minor issue for me. But if you want to explain why people vote for them, this is extremely important and necessary to understand that people who vote for, as for the German case, the National Democratic Party, who is fond of Hitler's Germany, this party follows very different traits as the now rising Alternative for Deutschland. Meaning that every explanation you have for a right extremist party, why they rise, why they fall, is totally unsuitable to explain anything with right-wing populist parties. The prime distinction criteria as for why that's the case, I point out here. The most important issue, coming back to the prime topic of today, is that right-wing populist parties have something in common with conservative parties. And this is the conservative position on key issues of migration, integration, and asylum. And this usually is a door opener, because I can say, well, you know, there's no reason to blame us for our program. We more or less say the same what the conservatives said a few years ago. And if you voted for them, respectively, if you didn't treat them as Nazis, you shouldn't treat us as Nazis either. Because what we do is more or less the same what they proposed. So don't be mean to us. We just do the very same stuff as the other guys, which more or less ran the country for 10, 20 years. Maybe in the course of the debate we can dive into this issue, but this is something I want to emphasize and underscore. Finally, who votes for them? Here, I use an example from Germany. I could have used examples from more or less every Western European country that would fit the bill as well. What you see here is something which in German is called Wählerwanderung, meaning where do the voters come from which aim for this party? For which party have they voted before they joined ranks with, in this respect, the Alternative for Germany. And there you see the various colors indicating where the voters stem from. The most important point I want to raise your attention to is the right side of this slide. Here you see something very important, namely that the Alternative for Deutschland takes almost an equal share of voters from all other parties. And this is extremely important for various reasons. It's extremely important to indicate, number one, that their voters do not stem from the fringes. They're not Nazis, they're not badly educated, they're not poor, they are literally the center of the German society. There are countless studies on this, that the voters of right-wing populist parties hardly vary on income, education, all kinds of variables from the average of society. This is the people, literally. They are the people. And why is this important? This is important for a second matter as well, to show that whenever someone says, well, you know, these parties are a problem to this and this movement, no, they're not. They are a challenge to all political parties because they equally lose votes to them. What you see very often is that some people say, well, you know, of course they are a prime threat to the conservatives. But people think, well, you know, they take their voters from the same base. This is totally misled. If they are a threat, they are first and foremost a threat to the Social Democrats. But I can elaborate on this a little further. Very important to bear in mind, they take voters from the center of societies, they are not from the fringes, and these voters are not poor, they're not stupid. In fact, for the German case, they're extremely well educated and they're extremely wealthy. And again, This slide I could present on the Lega Nord, on the Front National, and so forth. But since this presentation also gave up from the German crowd, I stuck with data for the AfD. Fourthly, another very misled assumption in public debate is that these parties thrive when societies face economically dire times. And this very statement is hilariously received if you talk to scientists. Because they reply, well, you know, since the 80s we know it's totally the opposite. These parties win when societies are doing fine economically. They lose when economies are doing bad. In recent years, the developments in Greece have been so oftenly in the media that people think, well, you know, the Greece system is collapsing and there's a right-wing party rising. Thus, this must be the link. And this is totally neglecting that in the last 30 years in entire Europe, the opposite has been the case. Why has this been the case? The reason is fairly plain. These parties, they hardly have any program in economic or social affairs. That leads to, when voters are concerned about their job, they want a party providing an answer for economic solutions. So overall, these parties only rise when voters literally have enough time to worry about something else than their job or the economic situation of the country. To this rule, there are, of course, a few notable exceptions. But overall, 90% of the gains of these parties result in times where the country is doing good. And 90% of their decreases happen in times when the country is doing bad economically. Most notable exception is Greece and France, but this can be explained as well. But again, I won't talk about this through this presentation right now. The fifth topic, more or less descriptive, very plain, you already know that most certainly. These parties are extremely important, they are extremely successful, and overall they have the impact of the third largest party in Western Europe. They more or less can rely on 20 up to 30% of the votes. They are the most successful in the Netherlands, in France, of course, and also in Italy, if you would like to add Berlusconi's party, which I do think is worthwhile. And they only do not exist in Spain and Ireland. These are the only two countries where these parties do not thrive. And what you also see is, this is very dire news, once these parties are in parliament, they usually don't vanish anymore. They rather rise. There is hardly any empirical evidence that a party which entered parliament would have slipped out again. There are only two examples, which is the New Democracy in Sweden and Republikaner in Germany, both in the early 90s, who entered parliaments and then disappeared from the political scene again. These are the two only decays, if you want, which are considered as electoral downfalls by political scientists. Other than that, if they are in parliament, they go through the roof, more or less. Sixthly, when these parties rise, what do they do? What impact do they have? This slide is a gross oversimplification of highly complicated political processes and mechanisms. So don't use this and don't quote me on this. This is just a snapshot of how you could summarize what's happening. When these parties attract voters with their very banal, binary, black and white thinking and proposing, well, you know, let's just come back to the good old 80s where we didn't have the European Union, we didn't have migrants, we didn't have emancipation, this was awesome. Let's just go back to these times. When these parties enter parliament with these arguments, two things happen. Either they grow further, or the conservatives co-opt their program, or the conservatives say, we do not co-opt their program, but we enter a coalition with them. Either way, their program will sooner or later enter government coalitions. And this will then lead to a major change in legislation. Usually, migration, asylum, integration law is tightened remarkably. Asylum policies turn out to be very hostile. Dual citizenship gets cut or blocked. And naturalization procedures get far, far, far more complicated. And first and foremost, what's it called? Affirmative action for minority groups is cut. Because this party runs on a program on on promoting an ethnically homogeneous society. So everything which is conceived as external influence you want to get rid of. And this then eventually leads to the fact that the societies where these parties are rising are extremely polarized. Because what they do is, of course, they shape camps in societies. They are not interested in being uniting, being integrative. They want the very opposite. They want to split and part the societies as such. Thus, you have a highly polarized political climate, which more or less is extremely concerned with its own identity. You have a lot of talk about the European Union, about migration, about the United States, and so forth. Everything which you conceive as a threat to your very own country, which you usually do not have if these parties do not exist, because other parties rather raise economic issues. They don't care so much about the identity of the country, normally. And this again, this is why it indicates a vicious circle. When you have this polarized society, people crave for easy answers even more. And this basically perpetuates the success of these parties even further. This was, of course, rather abstract. What I could have also have said is, again, don't quote me on this. This is very superficial and just used for presentation purposes. Instead of this, I could have put in here France, Italy, 2015. These are the prime examples of what's happening when these parties are rising for 20, 30 years. Or you might also say, to a minor degree, Netherlands, Norway, maybe. They could be fit in here as well. So finally, my last slide, the last slide is a slide where people who have been suspicious of my presentation usually start out hating me. Namely, why do these parties rise? These parties rise for two reasons. The first reason is that their program thrives well with at least 25% of the European electorates. If you have studies where you ask voters, what do they want from parties? What program do they want? And then you take the program of the parties on top of that, then you see that 1/4 of European voters support the program of these parties. It's important to underscore that it's an at least 25%. These figures go up in certain issues to up to 70%. And this then again explains why these parties more or less could rely on a solid voter base all the time in the last 30 years. And then the question arises, okay, if every fourth voter more or less is fond of their program, why aren't these parties here since the 80s? The reason is rather sad, but as sad as empirically backed up. In some countries, this program, these 25% of the voters are after, has been covered by other political actors. So other parties, the conservatives or social democrats, provided the program these voters were after. This implies especially to Ireland and to Spain, and also to Germany till recent years, that the program the voters wanted, tight integration law, no dual citizenship, programs which allegedly protect the national identity, which provides an alleged homogeneous society, has been provided by other parties. And to illustrate that point, I'm going to show you a slide on a long-term research project where you see when and why right-wing populist parties rose in Germany, and how this stands in striking relation to what the other German parties said about immigration. And this slide needs some explanation, of course. The black line is what the CDU-CSU said about migration. I'm going to elaborate on this. The blue line is what the SPD said about immigration. What I mean with said is what media reported on what the members of the board said. This is extremely important because the voters read newspapers, they watch TV, they don't read election manifestos. And the further this line gets up, the more positive these parties talked about migration, multiculturalism, and liberal asylum regimes. The further down these curves go, the more negative, the more conservative these parties talked about migration, immigration, asylum regimes. And there you see an interesting correlation. You see that in the late 80s in Germany and in the contemporary years, right-wing populist parties in Germany are rising. And they rise 2 or 3 years after that the established parties are not down here anymore. And down here means nothing else that the established parties want a harsh immigration regime, tight asylum law, and they reject dual citizenship. At that very moment, where no established party provides this program anymore, 1/4 of the German voters in this respect, they wonder who is protecting their interest. And this is then when an electoral niche is opening. But the, so to speak, good news is that the established parties can reclaim and stop this project, this process. When they start again to offer this program, then voters are inclined to return to these parties. And this is my last and final remark. This slide illustrates the extreme paradox, the dilemma established parties are facing here. Because what happened in this respect in the early 90s was the following. The German parties changed the asylum law. They made it far more difficult, far more complicated to apply for asylum in Germany. It's a famous, infamous Asylkompromiss in Germany, which is highly contested up to today. And this, in turn, led to this party to fall. And here you see the paradox, the limbo established moderate parties face. In order to get rid of these parties, in order to reclaim conservative voters, they have to deliver something which is extremely pricey. And if you talk to politicians, they are very much aware of this. And this consideration more or less dominates their assumptions, their talks, whenever they ponder about migration law, asylum law, or how to proceed with the European Union. They know if they step forward with something too liberal, too multicultural, too pro-European, they are more or less in the lurch because they might lose a substantial part of voters. And I'm sure this is something a lot of you will not agree on. That's why I want to finish my presentation here and open up for, I assume, contentious debates.